In the summer of 1776, the American colonies found themselves in a crossroad of history. For over a decade, every attempt at reconciliation had been rejected. Boycotts and diplomacy had failed them. War had been raging for over a year, and yet King George III and his Parliament still refused to acknowledge the rights of British citizens in the American colonies. The time had come for the colonists to take the next step. Colonial leaders met in Philadelphia, and the outcome of that meeting came in the form of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson's masterpiece changed the course of American history and ultimately would change world history. His words held such strength, such boldness, and such resolve. Surely the world had never heard of anything like the Declaration of Independence before. Or had they? To be certain, Jefferson was a master wordsmith, yet the concepts of freedom, personal liberties, and self-determination were not original to Jefferson. Popular opinion, based on 2 centuries of erroneous interpretations of where the inspiration had come from, maintains that Jefferson was inspired by Enlightenment philosophers such as Locke, Voltaire, and Montesquieu. And while they were contributors, they were not the only ones, and arguably, they were not the most important ones. The search for influence does not begin in England or France, but rather in Scotland, medieval Scotland to be exact. In the year 1320, the Scottish barons, backed by Robert the Bruce, sent a letter known as the Declaration of Arose to Pope John XII, requesting that he intervene on their behalf by recognizing Scotland as a sovereign country that England needed to leave alone, and for Bruce to be confirmed as the rightful ruler of Scotland. Additionally, they were clear in their promise that the people could overthrow any king who was not doing his job effectively or who became a tyrant. The ideas that came out of the Declaration of Arose, placing the people of a nation over their ruler, altered the course of history forever. From that moment on, the idea of freedom seemed to be an ingrained part of the Scottish identity. Over the next 3 centuries, at least 3 Scottish leaders used the sentiments put forth by Arose as a way of solidifying the relationship between a monarch and the people. The first, John Knox, who was the founder of the Presbyterian faith, taught that a biblical-style covenant was the basis of the relationship between a monarch and their subjects. He emphasized that a king was to be obeyed, but if that king broke his covenant or dictated that the people had to go against biblical principles, the people had not only the right, but the duty to overthrow that king. Likewise, George Buchanan openly spoke out against monarchs who abused their power or who were not living up to the expectations laid out by the law. He boldly stated that the people have the right to dictate to the king the extent of his authority, and that the king must rule within those boundaries. Lastly, Samuel Rutherford maintained that the king was the servant of the people, and as such, he did not have the right to take their possessions. If he did, he was a tyrant and an enemy of liberty. The essence of Rutherford's words gave inspiration to the American founders in defining King George, a tyrant. Between 1638 and 1649, a group called the Covenanters ruled Scotland. This decade of power was a brief hiatus in the centuries-long battle for control of the Scottish church and state. Though their time in power was relatively brief, the impact was far-reaching in both time and location. Their allegiance to the King of Heaven was top priority for not only the original Scottish Covenanters, but for the descendants who found their way across the Atlantic. From the time of the Act of Union of 1707 until the beginning of the American Revolution, it is estimated that over 250,000 Scots came to America, all of whom came instilled with characteristics of their Scottish forebears. The first was the influence of John Knox on their theopolitical ideology. The second was a fierce individualism which saw every man as the fundamental equal of every other. And lastly was their affinity for denying authority of every kind. Simultaneously, these years brought about not just Scottish immigration, but also the Scottish Enlightenment, whose philosophers recognized the need of government as a bulwark against anarchy. However, they also championed their students to strive for a new world of liberty and self-government. The power of their ideas were felt both in Scotland and abroad. In many ways, these changes began in the universities. Beginning in the 1730s, Scotland garnered an international reputation for being a frontrunner of multiple fields. With classes offered in English versus Latin and a common-sense approach to philosophy, Scottish universities created an atmosphere that American students were drawn to. Fortunately, the realm of Scottish education would not remain in Europe. In America, 4 of the first 6 major universities were founded by Scots. John Witherspoon is arguably the most influential university president of the Revolutionary era. He was one of the more forthright evangelical ministers in the Church of Scotland, and when he came to America, he brought with him a profound knowledge of the works of the leading Scottish authors, both past and present, which he applied to current events, and he attempted to impart that knowledge upon his students. Subsequently, the College of New Jersey became known as the Seminary of Sedition. As the Revolution drew near, Witherspoon unapologetically supported the Patriot cause. His sermons and his lectures reflected sentiments preached by John Knox, defended by George Buchanan, and espoused by Samuel Rutherford. And he would become the only minister to sign the Declaration of Independence. Though it is often taught that all Scots were loyalists, the truth is there were Scottish troops on both sides of the battle. In fact, evidence shows that in most major battles of the American Revolution, the Scots were a crucial part of the Patriot forces, and it was never questioned whether the Scots would stay and fight or not. According to Charles Hanna, the reason for this is they entered the American Revolutionary contest with a deep-seated hatred of England inherited from the past, with a passionate desire for vengeance, and with that never-ceasing persistence, which is their chief characteristics as a race. And in tracing their history down to this point, it would seem as if we could see the working of some inscrutable principle of divine compensation. For without the later presence in America of these descendants of the martyred Scottish Covenanters, double embittered by the remembrance of their outrageous wrongdoings done to their fathers and the experience of similar wrongs inflicted upon themselves and their families, the Revolution of 1776 would not have been undertaken and could not have been accomplished. The Covenanters' beliefs were deep-seated in the identification of the Scottish immigrants to America. Those beliefs then spread through the medium of Presbyterian sermons preached throughout the American countryside and American cities. But Scottish influence did not stop at the end of the war. 9 of the 13 original states elected men of Scottish ancestry to be their first governor, and the entire first presidential cabinet had Scottish roots. The scope of Scottish influence is endless. The influence of Scotland on America's founding is not one person or even a group of people, but rather an ingrained belief in liberty, of personal freedom and self-determination, whose theme consistently flowed from the 14th century until that fateful day in July of 1776. Those beliefs, cultivated by the Scottish, carried the Americans to independence, to victory, and ultimately to freedom.